So let's start with our introduction to the forensic alpha model, and specifically in Asia Pacific. For our agenda, we'll look at the history of fraud detection by GMI, and the first model we ever created called AGR, the Accounting and Governance Risk Model. Then we'll talk about stock returns and fraud detection. We'll go through the shortcomings of using SEC actions with respect to equity returns. Then we'll talk about the new world, the forensic alpha model, or FAM, and finally we'll talk about FAM and Asia Pacific. It's important to understand sort of the beginnings of this company, and that was back in 2002 with the fraud epidemic apocalypse. There was a true fraud epidemic that hit the US markets. NASDAQ went from 5,200 down to 1,500. And even more impressive, the big five accounting firms turned into the big four when the largest auditor in the United States, Arthur Andersen, was shut down by the Securities and Exchange Commission because of their involvement in not just the Enron fraud, but some of the other big name frauds. It was that fraud apocalypse, that epidemic, that was the motivation or incentive for the creation of the firm. And the first model we set out to create, the AGR, Accounting and Governance Risk Model, took a look at the world from a forensic point of view rather than a fundamental point of view. We got a whole bunch of smart people in a room, and they educated us on the difference between forensic analysis and fundamental analysis and how auditors look at the world. Our singular goal was to create a model designed to identify the fingerprint of fraud. And by fraud, we mean specifically a model trained on SEC enforcement actions of accounting fraud. And lucky for us, AGR was good what it set out to do. In fact, if you look down at this image, if you think about the best rated companies as being very transparent and the worst rated companies as being very opaque to the extremes being fraudulent, so we have this continuum, the worst rated companies by AGR are 13 times more likely to face an SEC action of accounting fraud than the best rated companies. So lucky for us, we had a good model. It turns out that when you have a model that can predict fraud, you also have a model which can predict class action litigations, can also predict financial restatements, can also predict financial distress and bankruptcy. It turns out the worst rated companies are 500 times more likely to face bankruptcy than the best rated companies. So lucky for us, we had a fraud model. Before we move any further, let's talk about what AGR is built on. What are the guts of AGR? And how do you identify the fingerprint of fraud? And it's all based on metric operations. We break the world into governance and forensic accounting. That's our taxonomy, where peering is the key. We have a proprietary peering system where we go by hand and put each company in their appropriate industry, and then we bifurcate those industry by size using either operating revenue for industrials or total assets for financials. On the governance side, some examples are executive insider stock sales divided by the total equity of the firm. We'll look at the trailing 12 months of this metric and then compare that to the peers. Again, peering is the key. We'll look at things like the CEO and CFO incentive pay divided by their annual compensation and look at the number of interquartile ranges, that is from the industry median. Again, industry median requires a peering. On the forensic accounting side, we'll look at something like accounts receivable over sales, and then we'll take an operation on that, like the 2-year volatility, which would be the error term from a univariate regression, again, relative to peers. It turns out that for these forensic accounting metrics, if the volatility is unusual relative to peers, that is, it is large relative to peers, that in fact does fit the fingerprint of fraud and also has information relative to stock returns. The important thing to note here is twofold. First of all, just taking ratios does nothing. The public market, the equity market, has consumed ratios. All that information has been gleaned. What you have to do is take a learning algorithm on top of these metrics in order to get information. And so the guts of our model are what we call metric operations. And there's a 2-year volatility operation, there's a 1-year change relative to peers operation, and then the current period industry comparison, where we look at the number of interquartile ranges from the median. The second thing to remember, again, peering is the key. Without a proper peering system, you cannot compute metric operations that are meaningful. Now, there is a secret as to why SEC actions fail to capture the full picture with respect to equity returns. So it makes sense that having a model that can predict fraud well would in fact predict, at least on the downside, stock returns. And it does, to a small degree. And we do have investment managers who continue to use AGR as a part of their risk factors. But the newest academic research and private research tells us that the SEC only catches about 1 out of every 7 frauds. Or said differently, the SEC misses 85% of the frauds. And that's not to cast aspersions. The SEC is there to act as a deterrent, not a catch-all. It's absolutely impossible for the SEC to catch every fraud. So what they'll do is they'll enforce an accounting action on a $1 million market cap company, And then they'll enforce an action on Apple, the largest company in the world, just to say, hey, the SEC is watching everyone, but we're only catching a few. The fact that the SEC is missing about 85% of the frauds does have a direct impact on a model to predict equity returns, which specifically is the data set is incomplete. We're missing 85% of the data. But there's even more difficulty using a fraud model, AGR, in order to predict equity returns, and that is the implicit relationship. It makes perfect sense to us to think that if you can predict fraud, you could probably predict stock returns to some degree. But here's the secret about SEC enforcement actions. When the SEC accuses a company of being fraudulent, they don't just put an X by their name and say this company was fraudulent. They actually name the quarters that were included in the fraud period. And the average fraud period is about 10 quarters, so 2.5 years. So if we think about Enron, which is sort of the great example of a company that committed a fraud and went to zero, yes, certainly the 7th largest market cap in the United States, which today would be the equivalent of Microsoft, went bankrupt because of a fraud. But lest we forget that Enron became the 7th largest company in the country because of fraud. And so there is a timing issue with respect to identifying a company's fraudulent behavior and actually seeing an expected stock move. Another weakness in using an SEC model or a fraud model in order to predict stock returns is that the SEC only has purview over the United States, which means there is no regional distinction when we go to Western Europe, Asia Pacific, and Japan. We simply say that fraud in the United States looks just like fraud in these other regions, and that turns out only to be about 70% true. Finally, something we wanted to address in the AGR model is that our univariate measure that we use is the odds ratio in order to determine if a metric belongs in the model or not. So we have 360 forensic accounting and governance metrics, but certainly 360 don't make it into the model. For AGR, it's about 90. We used an odds ratio to determine if a metric made it into the model, and it turns out there is something better. So let's go to the new world, the forensic alpha model, a model which will address the issues of using SEC actions, or fraud, to predict stock returns, yet still using forensic accounting and governance. So the most important part of FAM is, in fact, that it's built on the same guts, the same repository of 360 forensic accounting and governance metrics that pinpoint the fingerprint of fraud. It's the identical repository, or the identical apple tree, that AGR has access to, that our bankruptcy model has access to, that our litigation model has access to. We are the forensic accounting and governance experts. We are not experts in fundamental analysis. So how did we build FAM? First, we used large stock moves rather than SEC actions as the training set. And what do I mean? Quarterly stock returns, and I only included companies which moved up or down 10%. Then I took those companies and ranked their stock returns from 1 to 200. The companies from 160 to 200, so the top 20%, were included in the training set. And the companies ranked from 1 to 40, the bottom 20%, were included in the data set. And I did this for every quarter. So now we explicitly are modeling stock returns on stock returns, namely the top 20% movers and the bottom 20% movers, while also making sure that the moves are not trivial, that is, they're greater than 10% in absolute value per quarter. That addressed issue number one. Addressing the issue with odds ratios was fairly simple. We moved to something called the Summers' D. Summers' D is a non-parametric statistic designed specifically for univariate analysis. It's actually an old statistic which only recently has been discovered to be so powerful. The newest academic research tells us that the confidence limits for Summers' D and their differences are actually more informative than the traditional practice of reporting only p-values. Or in English, Summers' D is a better univariate measure than odds ratios, correlations, or tetracorrelate correlations. So using Summers' D, we went back to the apple tree of 360 forensic accounting and governance metrics and allowed this univariate measure to select which metric operations would make it into the model. Now that we're using stock returns, though, we no longer fall under the purview of the SEC. So I was able to do this process by region. And in fact, not only do you see different counts of metric operations by region, right here, there are actually different metric operations themselves in each region. There's about a 70% overlap, but there's some fascinating differences that pick up the idiosyncrasies of each region. And we're now allowed to do that using stock returns. The final step we did in the forensic alpha model in order to improve it from the AGR model, or in other words, in order to improve it from a model which predicts fraud and then implicitly predicts stock returns, is to allow for interactions. And one simple example is probably good enough. Imagine that you got information that there's a stock buyback. But what if I then told you that the CEO is also selling shares at the same time? It turns out that when these two things happen together, it's actually bad for stock returns. And that's one example of a very simple interaction. So while we need metric operations in the guts of the model in order to compose it, we also need the interaction of those metric operations in order to really pick up a signal that is unique. It turns out that signal, that interaction, has to be nonlinear, and the nonlinear classifier I used is something called a neural network. Now, for those of you that are used to supervised learning algorithms or artificial intelligence, you're used to neural networks. They're actually pretty old. They had their time in the light back when the BBC did their television series, The Machine That Changed the World, with text recognition. We've now moved well past neural networks in this realm. But it turns out, just like the Summers as D, which is an old measure, the neural network, which is also an old nonlinear classifier, actually turned out to work best for purposes of predicting stock returns. For those of you who are not familiar with a neural network, I'll just give you a simple example. This is the actual neural network that works for FAM, and it's actually pretty simple. You take the accounting score, you take the governance score, you take a multiplicative interaction between the two, and then you have them interact with each other on 3 different nodes. You weight these nodes based on machine learning, and you get out a final score. And that's it. That's how the FAM was built. Lastly, before we look at results for FAM, let's look at the sampling. Recall, we were only looking at stock returns that were greater than or equal to 10% in absolute value per quarter, and then only the top 20% of those and the bottom 20% of those. In fact, I used the years 2006, 2007, and 2008 as my in-sample, which has a regular year, a boom year, and a bust year, so it covers all market cycles. I also only looked at market caps between 200 million Australian dollars and 100 billion Australian dollars for the Asia-Pacific markets. That left me with 2 out of samples in the 2006 to 2008 time period, namely companies within the market cap group I'm interested in, but that only had small stock moves, and a second out of sample in this time period, which is all stock moves from market caps outside of the range I was looking at. Of course, that also leaves me a huge out of sample, which is 2009, 2010, 2011, 2012, and now in fact 2013, market caps inside the intended market cap range, and also companies outside the intended market cap range. And in fact, if I were to give you all 5 of these samples and label them A, B, C, D, and E, you wouldn't be able to tell me which one was the in sample and which ones were the out of sample. It turns out that if you do a little bit quick math, this box, the in sample, only represents about 8% of the population, whereas the rest of these account for about 92% of the population. In other words, the model was built on 8% in sample and 92% out of sample, so there is no overfitting. Also, since I'm using percentiles of stock returns rather than the stock returns themselves, the Asia-Pacific FAM is immune to market cycles. That is to say, it works across market cycles, whether we're dealing with a normal period, a bust period, or a boom period. Finally, because the metric operations themselves are built on industry peering, recall how detailed our peering is, there is no industry bias in FAM, which is to say that it works across all industries. Now let's talk about the impact on performance from FAM. Let's look at some actual performance in Asia Pacific. We'll start simple. We'll look at the top and bottom 5% of FAM companies, the best versus the worst. We can see the best rated companies returned 15.2% compounded annual growth over an 8-year period, with a standard deviation of 15%, where the worst rated companies returned negative 11.6%, with a 23.7% standard deviation. We're looking at a difference of 26.8% per year between the best and worst rated companies. And you can see how that looks in a wealth graph, starting with 1,000 Australian dollars. The best companies tripled in value, the worst companies lost over 60%. A fair question is to say, well, how much of that is due to your in-sample? Turns out not very much at all. If you take just the out-of-sample, so years 2009 through 2013, you can see the difference between the best and the worst rated companies is 22.2%. Very similar to our all sample. But maybe I'm choosing samples that just look good for FAM and Asia Pacific. Is this really the whole story? Let's try it again. Let's look at the all sample, which is 92% out of sample and 8% in sample, using the 5% portfolios, the best 5% and the worst 5%. We know that difference is 26.8% per year outperformance. What if I looked at a portfolio that was constructed of the top and bottom 10% of companies? Same time period. The difference is 25.7% compounded annual growth rate, almost identical to if we were using 5% portfolios. Well, what about the out of sample? We've seen this number before. This is the whole out of sample, 2009 through 2013, looking at the best rated 5% of FAM companies and the worst rated 5% of FAM companies. They show a 22.2% compounded annual growth rate difference. But if I were to take that same time period and look at portfolios constructed with the best 10% and the worst 10%, the difference is 22.5% compounded annual growth rate. Again, nearly identical. So what was the purpose of this exercise? Pretty simple. There simply is no overfitting in FAM. The model was constructed on a small N sample. It was constructed with a neural network that wasn't overfit. The result is that whether you're looking at 5% composed portfolios or 10% composed portfolios, whether you're looking at the all sample, the in sample, or the out of sample, whether you're looking at booms, busts, or regular years, whether you're looking across industries, FAM works across all time periods and industries and portfolio constructions. But the real question is, why is it happening? What's going on? And the answer to that cannot be it's a neural network, and the answer cannot be it's a sum versus D, and the answer cannot be it's an optimization, and the answer cannot be it's metric operations. The answer must be something that's qualitative. And in fact, there are two answers. There are two reasons. There are two phenomena which prevail in FAM. The black swan effect and the positive returns effect. So let's look at the first of these effects. It's called the black swan effect. For purposes of this demonstration, we're considering a black swan stock drop, anything that is a 30% drop or greater in 1 month time period. When we compare the best rated 10% of FAM companies in Asia Pacific versus the worst rated 10% of FAM companies in Asia Pacific over the time frame 2006 to 2013, so the full sample, we see that the worst rated companies are more likely to face a black swan stock drop anywhere from 17 times to 3 times more often. Specifically, the worst rated companies are 17 times more likely to face a 60% stock drop in 1 month or more, about 6 times more likely to face a 50% stock drop or more in any 1 month, about 3.5 times more likely to face a 40% stock drop or more in 1 month, and about 3 times more likely to face a 30% drop or more in any 1 month. And if you're wondering about statistical significance, which you should be, it turns out that all of these numbers are statistically significant to greater than 99.9999%. If you prefer charts rather than tables, I've included the charts for the 30% drops, the 40% drops, the 50% drops, and the 60% drops. The red bar represents the incidence of these drops for the worst rated companies, and the green bar represents the incidence of black swan drops for the best rated 10% of companies. And we can see in each of these figures how much larger the red bar is to the green bar. Again, the statistical significance of that difference is greater than 99.99999%. So it's the black swan effect that explains the negative returns in the worst rated companies of FAM. But why is it that the best rated companies have better returns? That's our second phenomenon. I call it the positive returns effect. Looking at monthly stock returns from 2006 to 2013, so 8 years, we simply measured how often, by month, the best rated 10% of companies actually had positive stock returns compared to the worst rated companies. And by positive, I mean literally greater than 0%. Turns out the best rated 10% of FAM companies have positive stock returns 54% of the time. The worst rated companies only had positive returns 49.2% of the time. And if you're careful and you look at this number, that means the worst rated companies actually go down more often than they go up. And we also know that when they go down with substantial, large stock returns. That's the black swans. I've also broken up the population again one more time Now I go to the 20% portfolios, so the best rated 20% of companies versus the worst 20% of companies. Look how similar these incidences are of positive returns, how similar these charts look. The statistical significance for both of these charts is greater than 99.999%. In other words, we can say with almost certainty that the best rated FAM companies, whether you're looking at the best 10% or the best 20%, have positive returns, in other words, monthly returns greater than zero, significantly more frequently than the worst rated companies. So in the best rated companies, you're finding firms that just have a tendency not to go down. Whereas the worst rated companies, they actually tend to go down more than they go up. Double that up with the fact that when they go down, they have a tendency to black swan, so go down a lot. And that's how you get the return differential that you see in FAM. It's the black swan effect combined with the positive returns effect. So we can see now, when we're looking at FAM results in Asia Pacific, in conclusion, that FAM works across time frames, whether we're looking at 2006 to 2013, or just the out-of-sample, 2009 to 2013. We know that FAM works for short ideas. That's the black swan effect. We know that FAM works for long ideas. That's the positive returns effect. We know that FAM works even better for long-short portfolios, where you benefit from both the black swan effect and the positive returns effect. Keep in mind the statistical significance of these findings means there's almost absolute certainty that what we're finding is in fact a true difference between the best rated and worst rated companies. Thank you for taking the time to listen to our introduction to the forensic alpha model, specifically in Asia Pacific.